Welcome to the Highland Heights Bible class. We are glad that you are with us for another conversation. If you haven't been with us in a while, we have been, for the last several weeks, been going through apologetics, giving a reason for the faith that we have as Christians. Now, as we all know, there are many people who try to come up with questions, try to come up with ways to go against the Christian faith. And for 2,000 years, Christians have been answering those questions. And so when we hear those questions, maybe it's the first time for us, but we have to remember that Christians have been thinking about this for a long time. So we've been using Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Faith, and looking at some of the questions that have been posed and looking at some of the best evidence, some of the best answers for those questions. So tonight we are going to be talking about the Bible itself. Many scholars, many people with too many degrees to talk about, make it their life's mission, make it their research agenda to go after the historical nature of Scripture. And there's many different names for the different arguments that they put forward as to why they believe the Bible can't be trusted, and therefore we can't base our faith on the Bible. But there's also very smart people on the other side who have built up research defending Scripture. So we're going to go through those tonight and talk about how Christians should think about the historical nature of Scripture. So Jeremy, you're the historian. Where should we start here? What's the first problem that people usually bring up?
Well, we got to start with first off the essentiality of the question. We've said a lot of times that Christianity is unique in that it makes real historical claims. Well, that opens us up to the charge that this is not history, that this didn't really happen. And so we need to establish that we can trust historically the documents that we're looking at. Specifically, when we're talking about Jesus, you're looking at Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts, okay, the four Gospels, and then the historical record of the earliest church and Paul's journeys and things like that. And as we've said several times, if those fall, the whole thing falls down, okay? We are making very specific claims. Those claims are built on a foundation that Jesus was a real person. He lived, he taught, he did these miraculous signs. He died, he was raised from the dead, and that the church grew and they did the miraculous signs that they did, and the gospel spread in that way. So we've got to establish how do we know we can trust these 5 books, and how do we know that there weren't other books? How do we know that these books are what they wrote? How do we know that they were being truthful in what they wrote? And how do we know that they gave us the complete story in all that they experienced and all that they're claiming? Because if you don't build those claims up, the whole thing really falls apart.
Right. And as Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that if the resurrection is not true, and that is the one central claim, as it's been said before, that the Gospels are extended passion narratives. Mm-hmm. These are collections of the accounts from different people, but all centering around 1 week. 1 week leading up to the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And so if all of these accounts are supporting this one event, this 1 week, Paul's right that this event is central. And that also means that the accounts that are leading up to it are also important for us to be able to trust. So not only is the resurrection important here, but the entire account. If it's not true, then we are to be pitied above all people.
Exactly. And you raise a couple of good points there. The first to kind of unpack, I think, is when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, if you're familiar with modern biographies, that ain't what we think when we think of a biography. Last summer, I had opportunity to read 2 of the biographies written by the guy that wrote the biography of Alexander Hamilton.
Ron Chernow.
Yeah, Ron Chernow. I'm glad you filled that name in because I was using it as an example. And as always happens when I'm trying to get a name, it ran away. I actually did not read the one he wrote on Hamilton. I read the ones he wrote on Washington and Grant. Yeah. These are 900,000 page books that, I mean, start at birth and go to death, and they're in depth and they're detailed. And Ron Chernow is a fabulous biographer, does a lot of good work and a lot of good research. And then you can sit down and read through the Gospels in a couple of hours.
Right.
And yet we think Jesus lived into his mid 30s, and you look, over 25% of the Gospels is 1 week out of 30 plus years of this life. Well, we have to remember that in that era, when they wrote a biography, they weren't interested in the nuts and bolts, nitty gritty details of everything and everyone, and who did this person ask to their junior high school prom, and they didn't care. They wanted to know, what are the lessons we need to learn from this person's life? Yeah. When you think about it that way, the Gospels make a whole lot more sense, because what's important about Jesus? Would it be cool to know what Jesus was like as a teenager? Yes, it would be fascinating to know. What was Jesus like, and how did he deal with acne and all of the things that teenagers have to deal with? But that's not the point of the life of Christ. The point of the life of Christ is his ministry, the signs, the death, and the resurrection. That's why we get 3 or 4 chapters on his birth and his childhood. Mark and John don't even deal with that. They just dive straight in. Jesus is around 30 years old. Boom. So when people say, well, they don't tell us the whole story, well, they wouldn't. You wouldn't expect that in the context of the times.
Yeah. Well, and you bring up, Mark and John not going there. So Mark begins this way, Mark 1:1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So Mark is going to establish Jesus is the Christ, Jesus is the Son of God, and jumps right into John's ministry. It's good of us to consider the birth of Christ, to look at Jesus in the temple, but Jesus gets on the scene very quickly in Mark. Many consider to be the first gospel, and I know, Jeremy, you don't. I do. But there is this immediate jump into, here is Jesus, the ministry of Jesus. And so if we're looking for what the authors, purely by volume, think is the most important story to be told, and the Holy Spirit inspiring these accounts, then yes, this is what really matters. So that's why it's so important. Okay, so let's get into our first big question. Some might say that that these are not necessarily accounts, but they're stories, that everyone knew who Jesus was, and so now it's important for us to just tell some of the tales that have grown up around him. The Paul Bunyans of our age. It's not so much important that it's true, so much it's important that we learn from the story. So, did the authors intend to be accurate?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And one, because again, the way Christianity grows, the way Christianity works, if this didn't happen, the whole thing falls apart. And we keep bringing that up because it is so essential. But we have to remember that their goal was to record faithfully what happened. And they make that claim. Luke, at the beginning of Luke, and this is where you see Luke as the classic first century historian. One, he's careful. He says, in the time that so-and-so was Caesar, so-and-so was governor, so-and-so was king. And in that era, that was how they dated things, okay? It's similar to us saying, on thus and such date, thus and such event occurred, okay? And we track it by the specific dates. Well, they say in the thus and such year of so-and-so, thus and such years. Okay, so Luke from the beginning is a careful historian, and you see that laid out multiple times through Luke and Acts. Okay, traditionally we say Luke wrote both Luke and Acts, and when you put them together, they are very clearly 2 volumes of one story. So Luke Acts is how you'll often see that referred to, and Luke makes those references multiple times through Luke Acts. He says, in thus and such year, boom, boom, boom. Second thing he does is he says, look, I went and interviewed eyewitnesses. I went and checked with people. Okay. So there's a lot going on there. One, these are eyewitness accounts. Okay. Matthew was an apostle. Traditionally, of course, Matthew is attributed to the apostle Matthew. So Matthew was an apostle. Okay, so he saw it. The tradition says that Mark, when he wrote his gospel, was recording the memories of Peter. So there's an eyewitness. Luke interviewed eyewitnesses, and traditionally we associate the Gospel of John with the Apostle John. So they're eyewitnesses. So they're not just saying these are stories. They're saying I witnessed it. So they're putting their credibility on the line. Luke is saying, I went and interviewed eyewitnesses, which it's important to remember when people say, well, how can we trust these stories? Well, they're telling these stories in Palestine within a few years of Jesus' death. Traditionally, one of the oldest historical records we have is actually out of 1 Corinthians 15. At the beginning of 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, I pass on to you what I learned, that Christ came, he taught, he died, he was raised, he appeared, and he lists the appearances. And it very much has the feel of kind of a catechetical statement, a creedal statement. This is what we believe. Well, if he picked that up, okay, if that was handed to him, that was probably handed to him during one of his early trips to Jerusalem, not long after he became a Christian. So you're within half a decade of the events that are being described. Okay. Well, if you're within 5 years of the events that are being described, there's a lot of people still alive. Paul says that in 1 Corinthians 15. Jesus appeared to 500 at one time. Some have fallen asleep, but others have, but there are some still alive. Go check. Okay. These are eyewitness accounts. They're saying this really happened. They're saying Jesus lived in the very place where they're saying these happened. Well, it's real easy to tear down Christianity if none of this happened. The eyewitnesses say this didn't happen. And what's interesting is the corroborating testimony. Okay. For a long time, there was this idea, and fortunately, this has been pretty much been given up even within skeptical communities, that Jesus didn't really exist. Well, there's enough evidence that Jesus exists. Now, we have to remember he's an itinerant preacher in a backwater province of the Roman Empire. Suetonius is not going to talk about him all that much. Okay. Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger, the historians we know of the first century, they're not going to talk about Jesus all that much because, ironically, to the worldly powers, he wasn't that important. I feel like there's a point there, but so there's not going to be volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes, but there is corroborating testimony. Josephus, one of the best known and best historians of first century Palestine, he has a passage, it's called the Flavium Testimonium, where he talks about Christianity and he talks about Jesus. The Talmud talks about Jesus. And what's really interesting there is both of those say that there were miraculous signs done. Now, Josephus just says there were miraculous signs done. Some people say he was risen from the dead. The Talmud actually says that he deceived many people and he did miraculous signs through the power of Satan. So even the contrary witnesses are conceding part of the eyewitness testimony there. Okay, so they very much intended to tell the truth. And what's more, think about this for a second. They are proclaiming the most strict moral code of that era, indeed of any era. One that called them to a higher level of honesty than anywhere else. Okay, Jesus said, don't swear an oath, let your yes be yes and your no be no. That's an integrity statement in the Sermon on the Mount. And they loved Jesus enough that they were willing to die for him. They honored him enough that they wanted to live out his life. And one of the core principles of Christianity is have integrity. Why would they make up stories when the core principle is be honest? It just doesn't make logical sense.
Well, and just to complete that thought there, not only would it go against their moral code, their moral statement, they would die for it.
Exactly.
And so that is something that even if you were making a power play, they're saying, okay, we're building up influence, we're gaining within our own homeland. No one would die for it without the wanting to recant. If you could somehow add on years to your life, as all of the apostles save one. Well, throw Judas aside for a second. All of the apostles save John end up dying for their faith, according to the historical record. So let's talk about the consistency of the Gospels. So
Okay.
sometimes there's different places where we could go here. We often think of the synoptic Gospels as Matthew, Mark, and Luke telling a similar version of the accounts. There's a lot of overlap between those, and some new pieces from place to place. John's a little different. Are there any issues with consistency we should be worried about? The one that I always think of first is the differences in genealogies between Matthew and Luke. And I know the easy answers there are, which side are we going through? But what are the other consistency issues we should think about?
Well, it's important to put the Gospels in their historical context. A lot of these consistency issues come up with variations in how something is phrased or the details that are included. Well, couple of things to remember. One, in first century biographies, in the first century world, you didn't have quotation marks. Okay. They didn't think of quotations the way that we do. So some variation would have been expected. The second thing we need to remember is that, look, eyewitnesses don't tell the same story. The example I use when I go through this with my students at school is growing up, my car was teal. And the only reason I know it was teal was because, to my eyes, it didn't look green and it didn't look blue. So I learned what color was in between. I mean, and you might look at my car as a 1993 Ford Tempo because I was cool, and say it's blue. You might say it's green. You might say it's teal. None of those would be a wrong answer. Okay. So there's going to be variations, different ways different perspectives people are going to have. And when you factor that in, and this is where things get really intriguing, when you factor that in, it actually becomes a point in favor of the credibility of the Gospels. Because if you have multiple eyewitnesses who are telling the same story in the exact same way, then you become suspicious that they sat down and they got together. If when I start seeing essay questions where the answers look exactly the same, one, I get really suspicious. Two, I'm like really disappointed because did you seriously think I wouldn't catch that? Okay. But I get real suspicious because look, two people who think and say the exact same thing all the time, at least one of them is not thinking for themselves. Okay. So that variation, and it's interesting, you talk to like defense attorneys and stuff, they're going to tell you it's about a 10 to 40% variation when you get to eyewitness testimony. The variation in the Gospels is about 10 to 40%, given which story you're talking about. Okay. So it's actually a point in favor that there are details that are subtly different, but the details that are subtly different don't contradict each other. Okay. They're not mutually exclusive details. And what's more, they tell the same story. Mm-hmm. The details of the overall details, the important details are the same. It's like if you see a car accident, okay? One person might say the color of the car was red, the other might say it was burgundy, okay? But if one person says the burgundy car rear-ended the other car, and another person says the red car T-boned the other car, okay, now we got a problem, okay? Because that's a fairly significant detail that you want to make sure you've got straight, okay? So many of the variations, when you look at it, they're fairly easily resolved just by misspellings or just subtle details that you would expect to find in eyewitness testimony. So ironically, the contradictions that you see, they fit what we would expect from people who saw and are telling their memories of what they saw.
Yeah. When you think about the different people who would have seen it, and that different things would stand out. So, when you have two different reports of a sermon that Jesus gave, first of all, Jesus probably gave the same sermon to different villages. As he's going to different places, he's giving a lot of the same teachings. And so when you see it reported one way here and it's reported a little differently over there, perhaps we're getting accounts of different sermons that Jesus is giving, or just it's the same sermon but with a different emphasis. And as John said, and many other things were done. So there's also another one that's listed is the cover-up test. Mm-hmm. And is there any evidence that there was a grand conspiracy to leave things out of Scripture? Often in popular culture, they talk about the lost gospels, these other stories about Jesus that came around centuries later, and they would make the case that these should somehow be included. Now that is a side issue. There's actually a lot of evidence that the gospel writers don't try to cover the bad image. A few examples here, and Jeremy, fill in where I might miss some things here. Peter, as the one who's informing Mark, Peter does not look very good in these gospel stories, and so perhaps this was the humbling experience that Peter has grown, and Peter's recounting when he used to sound like an idiot all the time. Yeah. Likewise, whereas the testimony of women would never be acceptable in court in a first century Jewish setting, women play an extremely important role in the gospel accounts, as they're the ones that are reporting from the tomb. They're the ones who are always seeming to be on the scene when these things occur, and are probably some of the eyewitnesses that are taking place there. Jeremy, any other cover-ups that they don't do a very good job of covering up?
Well, no, I think you've summarized the response to the cover-up test fairly well. When you do a cover-up, you don't insert the things that make you look bad. You tend to airbrush your image and make yourself look better. And you look at what they have, what Jesus says in the Gospels. We're very familiar with it. And then we get down to actually applying it, and we're like, wow, this is really hard. They don't soft soap. And it's one of those things where people are like, well, maybe they were covering it up. Maybe they were leaving things out. And then I look at the teachings of Jesus and I go, if this is what they put in, what did they leave out? I mean, you look, Jesus is like, if you want to please the Father, you have to be perfect as the Father is perfect. Wait, what? I mean, can't we bring that standard down a little bit? This is hard. She's like, nah, sorry. There are some challenging passages that we're still unpacking today. Jesus goes to Nazareth, and it says he could not do many miracles there because of the lack of faith of the people. And you're like, wait, what? I mean, we're presenting Jesus as God in human form, and then we say he's limited. When Jesus talks about his second coming, he says, I don't know the day or the hour that the second coming. And you're like, wait, you don't know? And so we've got to wrestle with those things. And then, like you pointed out, one, we talked about how all of the Gospels are eyewitness testimony. They're not the eyewitnesses you would want to go to in the first century world. Matthew is a tax collector, hated by his people. He's a collaborator. That's not somebody you're going to go to as your go-to standard. Luke is a Gentile, okay? In the Jewish community, that's not really someone you're going to want to go to. And then Mark, okay, Mark is putting down the recollections of Peter, and that's someone real high up on the list, okay? But boy, he doesn't look good in the Gospel of Mark or any of the Gospels. It's interesting. The Gospel that has received the most challenge, John, is the one that's most ostensibly by a member of the inner circle. Okay. But it's also the one where Jesus has some really, really hard things to unpack and figure out. So if it is a cover up, it's a really lousy one, because this is not what a cover up looks like. Okay. So basically all of the signs point to the best explanation is Peter put these stories in Mark, not because he wanted to necessarily, or at least not because he wanted to look good. Maybe there's a lesson there that he is putting in the bad stuff about him, so you'll look to Jesus, not him. And that's a whole different sermon. But Peter didn't put those in there because he wanted to look good. He put them in there because they're true. A little later on, we talk about why is the evidence for the resurrection. Part of the evidence for the resurrection is the women. Why you would not, if you were making up a story, women would not be your first witness in the first century world. The only logical reason in that culture to make women the first witnesses is they were, that it's true. Mm-hmm. So everything has this air of authenticity. And you pointed out some of the lost gospels that are out there. Many of those gospels, those apocryphal or pseudepigraphal gospels that come later on, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, one of the ways you can tell the difference is they just have this air of the fantastic. There's one, the cross gospel, where Jesus comes out of the tomb and he like stretches to the sky and the cross comes out and the cross is talking, which that's just a great mental image. And it's like, what? This is just weird. Like this is the kind of stuff you might see in a fantasy novel or something like that. And then you put Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John down, and yes, they're fantastic events, but they're fantastic events reported in a very sober and straightforward manner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so what we've done so far is talk about the contents of the Gospels themselves, and set forward this idea that what is written on the page or on the scroll, whatever they wrote it on, is accurate, is reliable. But the scrolls that we have are not the original scrolls. This is not the original writing. So what we have are copies of copies, probably of copies, and maybe another copy there. I don't know. How should we think about that? Should it bother us that we are relying on a copy of a copy of a copy? Now I know that some of the most close in time manuscripts are within 120 AD, so probably within 50 to 60 years of those pieces being written. But most of our manuscripts are from a couple hundred years later after that. So Jeremy, how do you feel about it?
Well, we have to remember first, scribes in that era were mind-blowingly careful. Okay. Just mind-blowingly careful, particularly Jewish scribes. Indeed, as a side note, just to address the issue of the Old Testament, until the mid 1940s, 1947, the oldest copies we had of the Old Testament were like, I don't know, 1000 AD. And so they're like 1500, 2000 years after the copies. And how do we know? And then we discover the Dead Sea Scrolls and we open them up and we're going through the Dead Sea Scrolls and we're going, holy cow, these are 1,000 years. Dead Sea Scrolls were contemporary with Jesus probably in the 1st century. These are 1,000 years older than anything we have, and they're almost identical. So they were careful. Okay. The second thing to remember is we got a whole bunch of copies of the New Testament. And they are, like you said, they are incredibly close in time when you look at a historical perspective. We've got something on the order of 5,000 copies of the New Testament. We have almost complete copies of the New Testament to within 300 or so years of the autographs, which compared to the next best attested ancient work, which is Homer's Iliad. Homer's Iliad, we've got somewhere between 10 and 20 copies, and they're 1,000 years after Homer wrote the Iliad. Okay. So compared to other ancient manuscripts, the New Testament is literally the best attested classical manuscript that we have on record. Like I said, we've got complete manuscripts. The three most famous are Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus. Those are within 300 or so years of the autographs. But we have fragments that go back. You mentioned the John Rylands fragment, which is dated to about 125 AD. And it's a small fragment, but it's part of the Gospel of John. John, we think, was written about 85 AD. So you're looking about 40 years later. And again, what's fascinating is we take these manuscripts and we compare them to what comes later, and they are almost identical. Okay. Now, sometimes you'll hear people throw out, there are 200,000 textual variants. And you go, 200,000 in the New Testament? Okay. If we have 10,000 copies of First Timothy, and we have one ancient manuscript where they misspelled a word or they flipped the word order. And remember, in Greek, it's the word ending that determines the part of speech. So word order doesn't matter. In Greek, man bites dog, dog bites man. As long as you got the right ending, it's the same sentence. Whereas in English, that's a very different concept depending on where we put the words. One is no big deal. The other is a front page story. Regardless, that if you have that one variant, just a change in word order in one document, and you got 10,000 copies, okay, that counts as like 10,000 variants. Okay, so it's not as many as we think. In fact, I think 99% of the variants, somewhere north of 90% of the variants, are things of spelling and word order, and not a single major doctrine of the Christian faith ever comes in jeopardy by a textual variant. So they were very, very, very careful. And we have had preserved just an enormous documentary heritage of these documents that if you're going to throw out, I've said this before, if you're going to throw out the New Testament, you got to throw out everything. Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, Suetonius' Lives of the 12 Caesars, you got to throw basically everything in classical history out, and we don't know anything. And I don't know of any historian that's willing to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I always like to ask people, do you believe that the Peloponnesian Wars happened? If you believe that, then you believe something that is separated in history from its recorded events. We should feel confident in that these things are preserved because they were so important. And so there's a reason why there's such detail, such scrutiny that was given to these. It's not like we're just now scrutinizing them. They've been scrutinized throughout the ages. So it's always been important that they maintain the record of what is written there. I will say, and also our even Bibles throughout history have been very humble themselves. We are honest as Christians when we say, we're not sure about this verse. We're not sure about John chapter 8. We're not sure about Mark chapter 16, setting it aside. In our holy book, we are saying, we don't know about this section. And other than handling snakes, we don't lose anything when we drop the end of Mark chapter 16. So there's promise there. We just have we need to wrap up here. Jeremy, let's go a minute on why these books. Talking about 1 minute on building the canon, and then one last minute on the history. Who is Jesus? So walk us through the canon, and then we'll end there after that.
Well, okay. People have tried to say that there should be other books, that there is a grand conspiracy by the church.
Shepherd of Hermas.
Yep, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Didache, the Gospel of Thomas, if you're familiar with the Jesus Seminar from about a quarter of a century ago, and now I feel old. Okay, here's the thing about it. They were very, 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 very careful. And the story of canonicity is a fascinating story that, in the remaining 27 seconds, I won't be able to get into in any detail. They were very careful. And the reason they were careful is they wanted to make absolutely sure. Okay. They applied 2 criteria. The book had to have apostolic authority, and this is important, it had to conform with established doctrine. Okay. And they wanted to make sure that they got the right set of books. What's interesting is outside there's some tinkering around the edges, like Book of Revelation. There were some quibbling about, and some of the general epistles and Hebrews and things like that. They quibbled about some of them, but eventually let them in. But what was actually happening was, generally speaking, 21, 22 of the books had wide acceptance, very, very broad acceptance. And the councils that came together that established the canon is like a council of the way I've heard it put is, you get a council of the best experts in classical music together, and they all come together and they all vote that Bach and Handel and Beethoven, I almost said Beethoven, that's not right. Bach and Handel and Beethoven and Mozart and Tchaikovsky and all of those guys, they're really great classical musicians. And we would all go, yeah, we knew that already. And that's pretty much what the church councils were. is they came together and said, okay, this is the official canon. And the church went, great job, guys. We pretty much had that figured out. And not with the sense of we don't need that, but as much a sense of, okay, look, this is the border, this is the standard, these are the books that are in. They were very careful. But the books they chose or the books that were chosen had a broad acceptance across the board. And the books that were left out were, generally speaking, left out for a reason.
Yeah. The one small thing I will add here, the story that I've heard about these councils is that and when they would present the books, like, is this a book? And if the book was one that was not to be included in the canon, they'd freely touch it. They'd go through it. They would look at it. But if it was a book that they believed should be a part of it, they would hold back and say, no, that is something that is holy, that should be included, and would be reluctant to handle it. Always one of my favorite stories there. Okay, so let's go with some closing comments here. Why is this important? What does this matter that Jesus is historical? Does this affect our faith? Closing comments.
It matters because, again, without the Jesus of history, none of this matters. Okay? Jesus, if we believe sin is real, and we believe that the justice for sin is real, then that justice had to be fulfilled. And it was fulfilled through a historical act of Jesus. And if we believe that we will be raised from the dead by the grace of God and go to him, we are basing that on the promises of a man that really lived and really lived again after he died. Okay? It's essential to the message that this really happened. This is the foundation of our faith. This is real. You can trust God when you're living through what feels like the worst year in history, okay? And, it's almost over. Because Jesus really did live, and he really did come, and he really did proclaim his message. Look, if this isn't real, they had every reason to deny it. They gained nothing. I get it. We live in a world where Christianity has been a dominant world culture for 1,500 years. And we live in a culture where until very recently, it was beneficial to claim Christianity as your religion. That's not the world they lived in. They had nothing to gain on this earth by proclaiming Christianity, and they did it anyway. That's how important they thought this was. They were willing to endure the most unimaginably painful death because it's true.
That's well said. The only other thought I will give here is to expound on that. God chose to enter into history. If there's ever been a historical event worth covering, worth recording, this was it. That is why, it's fun to compare the number of textual events for Julius Caesar, the first Roman emperor of the greatest empire, to this, Jeremy, as you said, itinerant preacher in the backwaters of Israel. This man who changed history was God incarnate. And so it makes sense that everyone in the world, whether you're for him or against him, would make it their life's mission to focus on this. If it's true, if it's not true, then it's without consequence. If it is true, it means everything. That's kind of a continuing theme of what we've talked about in this series. We've gone a little long, but I think it was worth it. This was a good conversation. There's plenty of resources on this topic, a lot more that could be talked about here, but I'm glad we had a chance to cover it. We will continue on. We're getting close to the end of the series, so we look forward to having another conversation next week.